My name is Steve Sint. I'm a professional photographer. I cover the greater New York area and the entire world. I've shot about 4,000 weddings and probably close to 1 million portraits of people. There was a time in my life when I did large format special effects photography in a studio setting only, but I became more and more interested in the interaction between the photographer and the subject, which is why I've gotten to the point where I primarily photograph people. One of the nice things about the Sekonic L358, which is basically one of my best friends when I'm on an assignment, is that the dome of the meter can be retracted. And once the dome of the meter is retracted, I can use that meter to read individual light sources. And once I can read individual light sources, I can turn around and figure out how hot I would like to have my main light and how strong I would like to have my fill light. It gives me the ability to set my lights individually so that I can get the effects I want. Equally true, the Sekonic L358 has a way of determining what it displays, what percentage of the light that's hitting the subject is from an electronic flash, and what percentage of the light hitting the subject is from ambient sources. And it gives this in 10% segments, which means you can really fine-tune it when you're trying to balance ambient light and flash. Actually, it is quicker than making the decisions with a TTL meter. Because when you use a TTL meter, the meter that's built into your camera, the first thing you have to do is decide what tone you're taking a reading of. And after you decide what tone you're taking a reading of, if it's lighter than a middle gray, you have to dial in a compensation into your camera. Or if it's darker than a middle gray, you have to dial in a compensation to your camera to take that into account. And what I find is that instead of spending time worrying about my subject's expression and concentrating on how they look and how they appear in my camera, I'm spending more time playing around with changing the compensation level of my camera's meter. With an incident light meter, I don't have to do that. I immediately get to where I want to go. It's important to understand that what I'm really interested in and what I really appreciate about incident light reading is that it's consistent. If you're photographing a bride who's a sea of white and she's your primary subject, as an example, you find that the TTL metering systems have a tendency to read they're all set up to create a middle gray from whatever you point the meter at, the reflected meter that's built into the camera. So what happens is that if you photograph a bride who's dressed in a massive expanse of a white gown, the camera has a tendency to underexpose that photograph so that the bride ends up always looking sunburned. Conversely, if you photograph a groom or a bunch of ushers wearing black tuxedos, or you're working in a dark catering hall, for example, the camera has a tendency to overexpose the black tuxedos and the dark backgrounds of the picture to get that to be a middle gray. So you end up with a bunch of guys who look pasty and white. So, you end up with, when you do the bride, you have a sunburned girl, and when you do the groom and his cohorts, you end up having people who look sickly. I primarily use incident light readings. What I'm interested in and what's really important to me about incident light metering technique is that it gives me a consistent reading, and it takes out of the equation, it eliminates the variable of what color my subject is. Because an incident light meter gets the light before it actually hits the subject and then gets reflected back to the camera. All metering technique is based on the concept that whatever you're pointing the meter at is a middle gray. That's the way the meters are calibrated to give you a correct exposure. It's often called an 18% gray. If you have a subject who's wearing a red dress or a yellow dress. The problem is that you have to make a decision with a reflected light meter or a TTL meter in a digital SLR as to what tone of gray that color represents. The idea for me is to eliminate the variable of what color is important, of what color the subject is wearing, and to get to the point where I'm reading the light before it hits the subject, meaning it is not affected by how the subject is reflecting it back towards the camera. In general, with large, broad, soft sources of light, I'm very, very interested in not using lights on my camera. The problem with lights on my camera is that very, very often with automation in today's digital SLRs, an amateur can buy a camera and put a flash in the hot shoe and through automation take passable pictures. What I look to do is create photographs that are demonstrably different than what a photographer could get with just a flash and a hot shoe. I actually hate post-processing. I find it a terrible intrusion on my time. I shoot about 108-hour days a year. If, for argument's sake, I was to do 1 hour of post-processing for every hour of shooting, that would mean that in the course of a year, I would be post-processing 800 hours worth of sitting at my computer doing that. 800 hours is the equivalent of 20 40-hour weeks, which is the equivalent of 5 months of my time. All of the pictures that I shoot a RAW plus a JPEG file, and my assistants laugh because if I have to open more than 5 of my RAW files for every 100 pictures I shoot, you can hear me screaming 20 miles away. I just finished a book on portraiture. It's called Digital Portrait Photography, Art, Business, and Style, and it's an interesting project. There are 3 chapters on lighting. There are 2 chapters on posing. There's a chapter on psychology for the portrait photographer, and I'm hoping it's well received. In addition to my 100 assignments, I also teach at a couple of different workshops. The main media workshops is one of my primary homes during my vacation time during the summer. The book is being published by Lark Books. It's available at Barnes & Noble or Amazon, both on the web. It'll also probably be carried by most major camera stores.